At the 2024 Lennart-Meri Conference in Tallinn, representatives of the three Baltic nations delivered a chilling warning to attendees. We're getting ready to march into Ukraine. All three, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, are ready to cross the border into Ukraine to help defend it against Russia, regardless of whether they have approval from NATO. In doing so, they would escalate tensions with Russia to near breaking point while creating a massive dilemma for NATO. Should it join the Baltic nations in more directly defending Ukraine, or sit back and wait to see how Russia responds? One thing is clear: the Baltic states see Russia's rising aggression as a major threat to their sovereignty, and that raises some key questions. What would convince the Baltics to send soldiers into Ukraine, and why would they want to do so in the first place? What are the implications for NATO? Plus, exactly how much of an impact would the militaries of these three countries have should they enter Ukraine? Let's start by digging deeper into the Baltic announcement. In May 2024, Yahoo News reported on several members of the Baltic states attending the Lennart-Meri Conference. There, they issued their warning to representatives from Germany, claiming that they were collectively prepared to march into Ukraine. Those threats, the outlet says, come as a result of all three nations being frustrated with Germany's approach to the use of its weapons in the Ukraine war. Namely, they're not happy that Germany has yet to permit Ukraine to use German-supplied weapons on Russian territory. The Baltic countries see the German response as half-hearted. They think it will do little to deter Russia if President Vladimir Putin and his troops know that they can focus on Ukraine without worrying about strikes on Russian territory. Worse yet, they open the door for Russia to gain significant ground in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern region of Kharkiv. If that happens, those gains would represent a major threat to both the Baltic states and Poland. Cautioning restraint, as Germany is doing, could backfire, according to the Baltics. After all, it could lead to Russia finally taking Ukraine, perhaps giving Putin the springboard he needs to launch other invasions in the Baltics. However, it's important to note at this point that none of the Baltics have sent troops into Ukraine yet. They may not even do so. Militani, a Ukrainian news website focused on war in the military, suggests that the Baltics would only consider troop deployment if Russia makes significant frontline gains due to Ukraine not having sufficient Western support. In other words, the Baltics are focusing as much on their own defense as that of Ukraine. Russian success in the latter could spell bad news for the former. This is far from the only indication that the Baltics are getting ready to fight. Another Militani report, this time from May 20, 2024, notes that Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has pointed out that there are troops from several countries in Ukraine already. Those soldiers provide training to Ukraine's forces. Estonia isn't one of those countries yet, with Kallas saying that such an action would require parliamentary approval. But she also says it's an open, public discussion, but I think we shouldn't rule anything out right now. In other words, Estonia sending troops into Ukraine is a possibility. There are also reports of the Baltics shoring up their border defenses to consider. In March 2024, The Conversation published an article discussing the collective decision of the defense ministers of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to create a shared Baltic common defense zone along their borders in January. Though full details of this zone aren't available, it's believed it will contain several physical defensive structures, including bunkers. In fact, Estonia is set to begin construction on 600 of these bunkers in 2025, in addition to working alongside the other Baltic states to develop missile artillery. The country has also doubled the size of its territorial defense force to 20,000. Latvia is doubling the size of its armed forces as well, to 61,000 by 2032, and reintroduced mandatory military conscription in 2023. As for Lithuania, The Conversation says it has formed an agreement that allows it to install a permanent brigade of 4,800 soldiers on the border it shares with Russia by 2027. In short, the Baltic states are preparing for war. That's where NATO might come into play. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all NATO members, having joined the organization in March 2004. That membership entitles them to collective defense as part of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which states that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. As such, every other NATO country is duty-bound to jump to the defense of any of the Baltic nations if Russia attacks them. Defense is the key word here. If the Baltic countries decide to enter Ukraine on their own volition, would the rest of NATO consider any Russian strikes resulting from that decision to be grounds to fight alongside the Baltics? After all, Russia would argue that the Baltic states provoked the attacks by joining Ukraine on the battlefield, meaning they're the aggressors. Other NATO members may argue that Article 5 doesn't apply in this situation because they won't be defending the Baltic states from Russia. They would be joining it in an attack on the Russian Federation. However, the Baltics represent an important buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. NATO can't allow Russia to take those three states. It would give Russia more control over the Baltic Sea, as well as important strategic positions it might use to intimidate or attack Sweden, Finland, Poland, and other nearby nations. Perhaps NATO members might find themselves in a catch-22 situation. Either they treat a Russian response to the Baltic nations as enough to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, meaning they also get involved in the Ukraine war, or they sit back and wait, potentially allowing a situation in which Russia gains more territory and becomes an even greater threat to the rest of Europe. That may be the point from the Baltic perspective. Rather than waiting for NATO to act, which all three agree is an invitation to Russia to continue its aggression, they'll take the situation into their own hands. In doing so, they'll force a decision from their NATO allies: fight with us or risk losing us to the Russian Federation. It's a dangerous game, though one all three seem willing to play. The question is simple: why? Why are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all three of which combined likely can't defeat the Russian military, so willing to risk incurring Putin's wrath by sending their troops into Ukraine? There are several answers to this question, with one already having been discussed. The Baltic countries believe that much of the Western response to the Ukraine crisis has been underwhelming. They argue that nobody seems to be taking the true threat Russia poses, as they see it, seriously, and that Russia may target them next if they succeed in Ukraine. Better to get ahead of the issue by fighting in Ukraine than waiting for Ukraine to fall and reacting to what Russia does next. As for why the three nations believe that they're potential targets for Putin, all three will see historical parallels between themselves and Ukraine. After all, just like Ukraine, they fell under Soviet rule in the aftermath of World War II. For Latvia, that resulted in a complete loss of its independent democracy. Though the territory had spent most of its history being ruled by other countries, the Russian Revolution of 1917 opened the door for Latvia to declare its independence from Russia in 1918. 2 years later, following fighting with both Russia and Germany, the budding Soviet Union recognized Latvia as an independent country. That independence existed under a democratic structure until 1934, when President Kalaris Ulmanis established autocratic rule. Then 1939 came along, and Latvia was essentially merged into the Soviet Union, first being forced to hand over military bases to the Red Army before being fully occupied by Russia in 1940. Though the Soviets played a large part in defeating the Nazis that claimed Latvia between 1941 and 1944, that help came at a huge cost. Latvia officially became part of the Soviet Union after the war, with Russia collectivizing its farms in 1949 and integrating its economy into that of the Soviet Union. The National History Museum of Latvia notes that this early occupation, particularly the years under Joseph Stalin's regime until 1953, was marked by arrests, imprisonments, and deportations. The first year of Soviet occupation alone brought with it the deportation of about 35,000 native Latvians, most part of the country's intelligentsia, with many thousands more following in later years. Exclusion from education, constant exposure to Soviet propaganda, and the Soviet Union trying to instill its concept of planned economy in Latvia were all hallmarks of this time in the country's history. Yet a large contingent of the nation's population yearned for the days before Russia arrived, the 20 or so years in which it was independent. When the Soviet Union was finally on the brink of collapse, Latvia managed to obtain its independence once again. August 21, 1991 saw the country become a separate state. Its people have no intention of allowing today's Russia to return it to Soviet rule. Estonia and Lithuania have similar stories. For Estonia, annexation by the Soviet Union came on August 6, 1940. Thousands tried to resist, with the University of Central Arkansas stating that 1,750 Estonians were killed as a result of the country's resistance. Tragically, a further 7,450 died between August 1940 and September 1944. As seen in Latvia, the Soviet regime began mass deportations even before the end of World War II, which culminated in 10,200 Estonians being sent to Siberian labor camps. A further 35,000 Estonians were conscripted into the Soviet military between July and August 1941. Again, like Latvia, Estonia fell under the Nazi regime during the middle stages of World War II. And again, as seen in Latvia, the Soviet Union successfully fought the Nazis off. But that period of fighting led to 70,000 Estonians fleeing to Sweden and Germany, along with a further 250,000 displacements and 39,000 more deaths. Following the war, Estonia became part of the Soviet Union. Early Soviet rule forced even more devastation on the nation's people. Over 2 days in March 1949, the Soviets deported some 20,700 Estonians to Siberian labor camps, of whom 3,750 died during the journey. More imprisonments came under Stalin, with the years between 1944 and 1951 seeing 30,000 Estonians arrested under political pretenses. Some in the country tried to resist. A collective calling itself the Forest Brothers, which was 15,000 people strong, staged an insurgency in 1944. It was to no avail. Estonia, like Latvia, fell under the Soviet yoke. Estonia was a little faster to throw off the Soviet Union than Latvia. September 1988 saw around 250,000 Estonians take part in pro-independence demonstrations. 2 years later, there was a call for independence by the Estonian Supreme Council. An official declaration followed on August 20, 1991, just 1 day before Latvia gained its own independence. Then there's Lithuania. In many ways, Lithuania's history echoes that of Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania had enjoyed around 20 years of independence from Russian rule before June 1940, when the Soviet Union invaded the country. It forced Lithuania to cut all of its existing political ties. Lithuania was also subject to a secret protocol within the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. It stated that any territorial arrangement of the Baltic region would see the country's northern boundary represent the end of the Soviet influence and the beginning of Nazi territory. As with Latvia and Estonia, the first 2 years of Soviet occupation saw mass deportations. Around 35,000 native Lithuanians were forced out of the country before Germany launched an attack of its own. Again, the story mirrors that of the other Baltic states, several years of Nazi occupation before the Soviet Union regained control. A guerrilla resistance existed in the country between the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Numbering about 40,000, these forces tried to combat the Russification of Lithuania and the repression that came with it. It failed, with Russia's extensive deportations cutting huge swathes out of the resistance until Lithuania was forced to comply with the Soviet systems being imposed on it. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the period between 1947 and 1949 alone saw 220,000 Lithuanians get deported. Many would be sent to labor camps in Siberia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union enforced the collectivization of agriculture, as it had in Latvia, yet underground resistance existed. For instance, Lithuania produced more samizdat, or unsanctioned publications, than any other country in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. As with its Baltic neighbors, the desire for independence existed. That desire was realized in 1990 when elections in Lithuania resulted in a legislature that declared the country's independence. The Soviets attempted to topple the newly independent government in January 1991. That attempted coup failed, and as we saw with Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania secured full independence in August 1991. Understanding this history is key to recognizing the Baltic position. All three countries have lived under Russian repression. They fought hard for their independence, and they know that they'll likely be the next targets if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. After all, as Putin made clear during his February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson, the restoration of territory to Russia is one of the main motivations behind his actions in Ukraine. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia based on historical context. He likely sees the Baltics in the same way. All were part of the Soviet Union between the 1940s and 1990s, and all fell under Russian control prior to the country's 1917 revolution. The Baltic nations have also had to watch Russia grow increasingly aggressive over the last 2 decades. While the special military operation in Ukraine is the most obvious example of this aggression, they won't ignore Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Then there's the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, which was over in just days, but marked the first war Europe saw in the 21st century. Like the Baltic states, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. Worse yet, the response to Russia's invasion of the country from the international community was surprisingly muted, an early sign to the Baltic states that their allies weren't taking Putin's aggression seriously. They believe they can't afford to allow the rest of Europe to make the same mistake. And these aren't the only reasons why the Baltic states are considering entering Ukraine. Putin has also made direct threats to all three of them. On May 22, 2024, mere days before the Baltic nations discussed sending troops into Ukraine at the Lennart-Meri conference, Politico reported on a Russian draft decree. Though that decree is now deleted, it showed a Russian proposal for the redrawing of its borders within the Baltic Sea. The proposal would essentially see Russia take control of sea territory currently overseen by Finland and Lithuania, with the latter being quick to respond that the draft represented little more than a threat. As Lithuania's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, said to Politico, Russia's actions are seen as deliberate, targeted, escalatory provocations to intimidate neighboring countries and their societies. This is further proof that Russia's aggressive and revisionist policy is a threat to the security of neighboring countries and Europe as a whole. Perhaps that statement could be more accurately categorized as yet another wake-up call delivered to Europe from the Baltic states. Finally, there's Sweden and Finland's decision to join NATO to consider. While certainly good news for NATO as a collective, and the Baltic states in terms of their concerns about Russia, it also brought more threats from Putin. That's because Putin recognizes that Sweden and Finland being part of NATO opens up the Baltic Sea to NATO's forces. Bad news for Russia, given that it sees the Baltic Sea as strategically important to its navy. Its exclave Kaliningrad, for instance, is home to the only Russian port on the Baltic Sea that's available all year round. An increased NATO presence in that region could provoke action from Russia's president. The narrative around Sweden and Finland joining has certainly suggested that many NATO members consider their decision a victory in the Baltic region. Chatham House points out that some have even started to refer to the sea as a NATO lake. Now the collective can run more training operations and is in a better place to defend itself from Russian aggression. However, the decision also opens the door for Russia to push back, potentially leading to it taking a more aggressive stance against the Baltic states. If it does, those states argue, NATO needs to be as ready as they are to fight back. All of which brings us back to the Baltic statements about heading into Ukraine with or without NATO. If they follow through, what can they deliver to Kyiv? All three have already been massive supporters of Ukraine during the war. They each fall into the top 5 in terms of military aid provided as a percentage of gross domestic product or GDP. Latvia has provided 1.5% of its GDP, combined with bilateral donations and those made via the European Union, while Estonia and Lithuania have each provided 1.8%. They also led the way in terms of institutionalizing the aid they provide. Lithuania, for example, has pledged to offer constant support to Ukraine through 2026. The Baltic states see these contributions as being akin to their bolstering their own defenses. All are also engaged in concerted campaigns of de-Russification. Latvia has adopted a new law that will see Russian language teaching phased out of public education by 2025. In July 2023, Lithuania stripped residency permits from 135 Russians living in the country, all of whom it deemed security threats. Estonia has taken similar action, in addition to barring Russians from crossing its border soon after the Ukraine war began. The message is clear from all three. They not only oppose the war, but are actively trying to rid themselves of the Russian influences that remain following the Soviet Union's collapse. As for the direct military assistance each could provide, it's important to note that none of the Baltic states are considered particularly strong, especially when compared to Russia. In Global Firepower's 2024 ratings of 145 military nations, all land in the bottom half of the list. Estonia's position of 87 out of the 145 is the best the Baltics can muster. But that doesn't mean they would not be useful in the fighting. Starting with Latvia, the lowest ranked of the three at 99, the country has 65,750 military personnel, of whom 17,250 are part of its active military. The rest make up its reserves, along with 12,500 that are part of paramilitary groups. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Latvia has no tanks, though it maintains a stock of 1,544 vehicles. It could also bring 59 units of self-propelled artillery into Ukraine, as well as lean on its 6 mine warfare vessels to cause issues in the Baltic Sea. An underwhelming force perhaps, especially when considering who Latvia will be fighting, but that small army will be propped up by Lithuania and Estonia. GFP says that Lithuania could bring more military personnel into Ukraine, as it has 141,150 in total. Granted, only 23,000 of those people are part of its active military. However, it has 104,000 reservists upon whom it could call, along with 14,150 paramilitary troops. Like Latvia, it has no tanks to offer, though it can bring about 1,300 vehicles to the fight. Add to that its self-propelled artillery and towed artillery, 21 and 54 units respectively, and you have a decent amount of ground warfare equipment. Like Latvia, Lithuania's navy is small, consisting of just 11 assets. However, 4 of those are mine warfare ships, creating the potential for it to team up with Latvia to make the Baltic Sea a more dangerous place for Russian ships. Lithuania would also be able to bring a handful of helicopters and fixed transports to the fight. Finally, there's Estonia. The most powerful of the three according to GFP's rankings. Estonia has 96,500 military personnel, of whom 7,700 are active. It brings 6 units of rocket artillery to the conflict, along with 24 self-propelled artillery units. Plus, it could add another 1,409 vehicles to Ukraine's forces. A handful of helicopters and fixed-wing transports would also prove useful, as might Estonia's small navy. It could add 4 more mine warfare ships to the Baltic Sea. These stats show that none of the Baltic nations are powerhouses, but perhaps that isn't the point. The 3 states will feel a certain kinship with Ukraine, having all previously fallen under Soviet rule themselves. They'll also see Putin making threats against them, and likely consider themselves the next target should Ukraine fall. For that reason, they'd enter the conflict with motivation, not only to help Ukraine but to defend themselves. They could potentially stretch the war's front lines to include their borders, spreading Russia's troops thin in the process, and use their navies to force Russia to expend resources in the Baltic Sea. Then there's the NATO question. Would the Baltic states entering Ukraine serve as a signal to NATO, and particularly the organization's European states, that it has to get involved? Maybe that's what the Baltic states hope for. All three will know that their militaries aren't powerful enough to cause major problems for Russia without support from the West. By entering Ukraine, they may seek to show just how fragile the Baltic buffer between Russia and Europe is, forcing NATO to respond to prevent Russia from taking their territory. If so, it's a risky gambit. Only time will tell if the Baltic nations follow through on their proclamations that they'll enter the Ukraine war if Russia takes more ground. With that, we conclude today's video. Let us know what impact you think Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia could have on the Ukraine war if they joined. Would they manage to force NATO's hand, or would the rest of Europe sit back and wait to see how it all pans out? Share your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out how war in Ukraine is de-Russifying the Baltic states, or click this other video instead.